are literally shaping the planet.
Purpose is the only pathway to a regenerative future.
We have a choice to stay with the status quo or to change.
What is the point of trying to be just resilient when we can actually innovate?
Welcome to People and Workplaces. Thanks for joining me today. I am Sara Maffey, and as Kayla kind of just went through my background, I thought it would be helpful to just give a little context to what I'm about to start talking about. So I started thinking about workplace and placemaking when I was at NYU, and really started thinking about how the Lower East River was developing after September 11th. All the small businesses and the piers on the Brooklyn side that were all being kind of considered at that time. After getting my MBA, I was a presidential management fellow at the Department of Commerce, and that was the time that department was really partnering with Michael Porter at Harvard to talk about industry clusters and really intentionally investing in developing those industry clusters around the country. And somewhere in between, I started a passion project of micro placemaking, where I curate gifts that are all from local makers and local experiences. That's kind of my nerdy hobby. And along the way, I've entered into commercial real estate, and most recently at Transwestern. And there I am repositioning assets, looking at redesigning lobbies and marketing and really the whole experience of a place. I sometimes call myself the queen of pink granite and green marble. If you know what I mean, then you know what I mean. And so with that, I just wanted to give a little definition of placemaking, because I'm probably going to say this word a lot. And I think it helps for me to just define it up front. So placemaking is really the act of creating a sense of place. And I think that there's deep roots in this concept, primarily from an urban design and community development standpoint, starting sometime in the 60s. But really, I think taking place more so in the last decade as it's transitioned into multifamily and mixed-use development, and really, hopefully, more and more our offices. So I'm defining placemaking today as contextual, intentional design and experience programming that drives social connectivity and business or economic value, depending on what your perspective is. So a question that I get a lot is, what do you see happening? What do we see happening? And I'd like to just kind of start off right off the bat by saying that we're not going to go back to normal. I think that there's sort of a split view right now within commercial real estate of people who would like to pretend that, you know, a light switch is going to flip and we're just going to go all full bore back into the office. But I think the evidence shows more and more that that's fundamentally just not what's going to happen. And I think that there's a lot of reason for that. And the evidence of that is that organizations were already changing before the moment that we find ourselves in today. And so I think it's interesting for me to talk about this topic today, because we are really in this pivot point. And the pandemic has drawn a line in the sand. So organizations were already changing the way that they were operating, allowing work from home, allowing remote work, just starting to allow for more flexibility. And of course, this always starts with the tech world, but it started to really migrate into other industries as well. And so some of the things we've been seeing have been increased mobility of companies. You're seeing companies just move completely to different states, different countries, expanding. And that was all happening beforehand, because I think that part of the interesting thing that's been happening is that people are moving as well. The workforce is moving. So this idea of industry clusters, where you're really trying to chase the talent in specific industries, and it doesn't all have to be in Silicon Valley, which we're seeing right now, for example, with tech. We're seeing a lot of smaller cities, maybe third-tier cities, secondary cities, attract a ton of talent, because those are the cities that still have a sense of place And a lot of them have spent the last couple decades developing that sense of community and really investing in those kind of community amenities. So overall, I think my big takeaway from the last 6 months is that trends that were already happening are accelerating, and that acceleration is happening very, very quickly. And so as all these changes happen, organizations, companies adapt their approach to real estate decision-making. And this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because I think that, there seems to be this sense of urgency right now, but we've been going through this for quite some time. So if you look back in time and you think about the origins of where companies located where they did and how they kind of set up their workplaces at that time, it was a little more organic. Industry clusters formed where the natural resources that they needed were located. And if you wanted to work in those industries, then you went to those locations. And I think a lot of it was just kind of based on what your family historically did or what your region historically did. And then we move into more of a modern age. I call it sort of the Mad Men age. And it's that whole mentality of, if we build it, they will come. That location, location, location. People were moving to cities, major cities primarily, to move for jobs. And what you see in architecture and urban design was really creating much more formal places, less of an emphasis on community and stakeholder engagement. And then, with the tech age, we kind of entered into this postmodern world, which I think is very much exemplified by Facebook, the whole Facebook model. The idea that millennials wanted somewhere cool to work, and all you needed to do was give them snacks and put in a ping pong table. And the whole idea really started playing out in multiple avenues within real estate of live, work, play. So, and then again, this is really where that idea of purposefully developing industry clusters in cities that might not have had, biotech or various tech fields, were all of a sudden all kind of clamoring to develop those skill sets and attract those workers and therefore those companies. But I think that more recently, and really when I say recently, I mean the last 5-ish years, not the last 6 months, but I think that it's certainly accelerated. We've entered into this meta-modern period where companies are really moving to the talent instead of the reverse. And really, I think in the last 6 months, it's accelerated the need to allow that talent flexibility and choice in where they work, when they work, how they work, and all those different aspects. So place has become optional. And typically when I say that phrase in person, there's sort of an audible gasp, like, what? No one wants to hear that. But I think it's becoming just so much more evident that that's the reality. And so we have to add value through really emphasizing culture, creating opportunities for connectivity, and creating authentic places that people want to choose to be in when they have so many options. And so I think that we've moved from location, location, location to people, people, people. And so with that as the basis, I think the number one problem to solve for organizations and their decision driver remains talent, even today. So obviously we are all very aware of the spike in unemployment. This is in the US as of Monday. And I think it's really important to note that not all of the unemployment was necessarily, I guess, from the workforce that we're talking about who were working in offices. So I think part of that is a caveat to this. But I also believe that what happens during this period is going to stay with us and these organizations as we move out of this period. So the decisions that are made today around flexibility, around real estate, are going to reflect on those companies for the next decade and play out in the battle for talent that will continue to happen. So I think it's still important to remember that people, people, people should be our mantra right now, not location, location, location. And really, I think that disasters present us with an opportunity. So it's an opportunity to create something new, to really rethink how we've been working, how we've been thinking. Some companies may choose to stay in the status quo, maybe getting everyone back in the office as soon as possible. But I think that overall, we're going to see more of a hybrid model, and I'd really like to embrace this as an opportunity. All right. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. So there is a lot of uncertainty right now. And I think there was a lot of uncertainty even prior to this. There was a lack of clarity around what kind of space people should be going into, how much space they would need. A lot of companies were struggling to understand the connection between space and people and their business model. And there were just so many alternatives, you know, that were already starting to crop up of working from anywhere, really. And this is only accelerated. So now we have uncertainty around the economy. Will there be more layoffs? What kinds of decisions can companies make around their real estate if they don't really know what's going to happen? A lot of companies are simply just putting off that decision right now, maybe going into spec suites, maybe going into sublease space, or just not taking a lot of space at all right now because no one's in the office. One of the big kind of questions that's come up is around collaboration. So, you know, a lot of people, a lot of workers, the research shows, are more comfortable and more prepared to collaborate in person. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to work on collaboration virtually, even though we have a lot more tools at our disposal. It's a learning process. Another big topic is culture. And I would argue that right now, this moment of uncertainty is wonderful for culture because we have an opportunity to rethink what that culture was. But it's also a moment to stop and think, how were we building culture before? Were we really dependent on our workplaces and being in person? And then, of course, there's uncertainty, which we're all aware of do we return to the office? When do we return to the office? How do we return to the office? Because of our health concerns right now. And our health concerns are also creating opportunities, which I'll go into in a moment. Something I find really interesting about all this is just how our personal lives have become so much more ingrained in our daily lives now. I think a lot of times there was more compartmentalism happening before. And so now that uncertainty is also reaching into our professional lives as people deal with kids at home and all sorts of health issues and just general anxiety around what's happening today. There's also just behavioral learning type things where if you're not in person and you're hiring new people, how do those people learn sort of the tacit learning that happens by observation and bringing people up to speed, growing networks, having those happy accidents within the office. And I think the biggest thing as companies may be starting to decide to take space is, okay, well, how do we use this space? How do we design this space? And I think that's an opportunity, again, to be very planful around what happens. So I call a lot has been written about this being a great experiment. And that's not my favorite way of describing it. I think that if it were truly an experiment, we would have planned a little bit better. Some companies certainly were prepared. They were already starting to work remotely. They had the tech in place, maybe the managerial systems in place to deal with this. But by and large, sometime in mid-March, depending on where you live, everyone went home and it was kind of, Godspeed, let's hope this works out. And by and large, we see that it has worked out. And I think that that's really what makes this an incredible pivot moment. So we're following this wave of the experiment, which is a variety of different experiences, challenges and benefits that kind of change as we go through this with time. there's been so many different surveys, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But I've kind of averaged them, and here I'm using the number from the PwC study, which is 72% of office workers would like to work remotely at least 2 days a week. And so what combination of that actually ends up being, is it 1 day? Is it 3 days? Is it 4 days? Did they respond 5 days? It's some combination thereof. And it's really about giving flexibility of where and when these workers work. And it's interesting because a similar percentage is talking about productivity. And so a lot of employees are talking about how their productivity has increased or not changed during this time. There's lots of theories of why that is, maybe because of general concern around overall economic conditions. Maybe it is truly because they're optimally working from home. But they're also in similar numbers reporting negative impacts, those things that we can consider, loss of culture, loss of social connectivity. And it really all just depends on a variety of factors that impact how they're working, how the company has handled that change to working exclusively from home. So just a reminder, I think I've laid out a variety of reasons why we are never going back to normal. And really our focus needs to be on people, people, people. So I think to just respond to a lot of the concerns we just went through, a lot of the solutions can come from just being more human-centric strategically and really responding to the dramatic shifts that have happened in our habits and our way of working over the last 6 months. And so the question I would like to pose is, what if our workplaces, and I put work in parentheses because I'm really talking about so many different options at this point, what if our workplaces become more human-centric? And what does that mean? So for me, I really think it boils down to 3 major tenets. One is focusing on culture. The next is that social connectivity. And the third is choice. So with culture, the way that we built it may not be A, how we can maintain it, and B, how we want it to be. So, I alluded before to culture being created and really based on place. And so if you worked for a company that really spent a lot of money on heavily branded space and bought into that whole idea of live, work, play all in the office, then this might be a time when your bank of culture is sort of being drained because you haven't figured out how to do that in a virtual way. And I would argue that maybe there's not a lot of depth to that culture if that's what's happening. And another interesting aspect of that is, what was that culture based on? Was it a culture of door watching, needing FaceTime, based on old sort of relationships? And is this an opportunity to really rethink that and sort of create a more equitable workplace? And along with that, I think just having everyone go through this globally on the same level, there's an opportunity to create a culture of empathy. And we're certainly seeing a lot of increase in focus on building diversity and inclusion in our workplaces, not only within our teams, but I think just how our workplaces, our offices respond to different types of people and their needs. So I was recently doing a podcast with Kay Sargent of HOK. She's their global head of workplace. And she was just talking so much about the need to respond to neurodiversity in the workplace, that not everyone's working well in these sort of open desk farms that are happening. And maybe this is an opportunity to create a space that works well for everyone. Another big focus right now that I think is ingrained in our culture moving forward is a focus on health and wellness. And what a perfect way to really get fully on board with that than responding to a health pandemic. But these 2 things have really been sort of in the conversation for quite some time. And I think the need to have health be a part of our daily lives. And so our daily lives are often spent in workplaces. And how do we combine those things and bring it closer to people during their daily lives? And how do we create wellness opportunities that aren't just the typical fitness facility, maybe creating more opportunities for mother's rooms, migraine rooms, meditation rooms, solo fitness rooms, maybe with a mirror or a Peloton. Those types of things are becoming increasingly more important. And just looking at amenities in general, I think that in some cases we see our companies looking to add amenities within their space, but especially as as companies are hesitant to make major real estate decisions, I think it's going to become more and more incumbent on landlords to provide those amenities to companies. And I think also thinking about virtual amenities. So right now, you might have amazing amenities within your office building, but it doesn't really matter because no one's there to use them. So secondly, we move on to social connectivity. And I did a whole video series of this over the summer called Social Connectivity x Social Distancing, because I think it's just such an incredibly important part of our experience of place. And we need to shift to be able to do that virtually. So just recognizing that how, where, and why we work has completely changed. The conversation of virtual versus in-person, all the different technologies that we're now using, the fact that I'm doing this on Zoom and not in person. And there's so many apps now and things like that to build connectivity within our teams. But also recognizing that we need to find ways to still create connectivity, whether it's in person or remote, so that we create opportunities for tacit learning and happy accidents, those times when you talk to somebody in the kitchen getting a glass of water that you might not have spoken to before, and suddenly you have like that aha moment of potential collaboration. And again, I spoke about how a lot of people are sort of conditioned to believe collaboration best happens in person, but I think that we are going to increasingly see opportunities to do that more meaningfully virtually, because it's going to be a necessity moving forward. Though I do think that a lot of the conversation right now around being in person is around the need for collaboration. So perhaps the reasons we're going into the office are no longer for heads down work, but for more collaboration work. And finally, choice. Again, in one of my podcasts, I was speaking with an organizational behavior professor, and her comments around choice were so fascinating to me because it made so much sense that now we've all had this opportunity to work remotely, to have that flexibility, and to remove that choice and that flexibility can have devastating effects on our motivation and our morale. So just thinking about that in the decision-making process. And also just responding to the moment that, oh, I think someone might have joined us. To respond to life that's happening, I show a picture of a mom working with her baby. We've all been on calls with babies now. Our habits have shifted, and we're demanding that flexibility. And by offering that, we're empowering our workers to choose what's best for them, and therefore really getting the most investment and buy-in and creating the best opportunities for those employees. And I think, again, this will speak to a company's ability to recruit and retain talent in the future, that flexibility, that choice is not going to be optional. It's going to be a requirement. So I guess what I'm really describing here is an optimized ecosystem of workplaces. And I've taken some recent clips of announcements that have been made that really speak to just the incredibly broad way that can be interpreted. So that flexibility could be Amazon announcing that you can work in any of their offices as long as you're in the office. And it could also be, an REI who's just built a beautiful campus and decides to sell it before occupying it because they're going to start working in multiple locations, allowing for more work from home. It's a hybrid, and it's almost, it's more than a hybrid. It's so many different options, and it's really an ecosystem of how and where we will work in the future. So for me, I think that the great experiment really needs to start shifting into a plan. And we need to start being planful about where we go from here. It's not just kind of making the best of, people taking their computers home and trying to see how it goes. BCG in a recent study said that they see the future as with an increasingly distributed workforce in a workplace whose physical footprint will have shifted beyond recognition and will serve very different needs. And so for me, I think that the immediate need is for organizations to provide a smooth transition and a smooth change into what that future is going to be. And the best way to do that is by having a plan and having that plan be designed with their best interests and their health and wellness, their need for social connectivity, all these factors that have been proven to not only lead to productivity. I think that's the carrot on the stick for companies, but really thinking about us as people in our workplaces. What does that need to be? So just being very planful about our places. And on the other side of that, that's kind of the tenant side, the company side. I think that there's a real demand right now for landlords to start paying attention to this conversation. We're seeing sharp increases in sublease space. We have organizations delaying major real estate decisions. And Barclays recently predicted that there would be a 20% decrease in the demand for office space going forward. I think there's so many different percentages out there, but I think if we're looking at just that momentum going forward, so now is the time for landlords to say, well, we want people to choose our workplaces. And in order for that to happen, we need to upgrade and amenitize our assets to become more human-centric and really create reasons for people to actually want to be in those places. I think that those that really get this right now are going to position themselves for success. And it's also going to enable everyone to simply be their best selves, bring their full selves to work in wherever and whatever format that means. And ultimately, that will lead to more creativity, more innovation, more collaboration. And I'm really excited about the opportunities that will lead to. So in closing, I'd like to just say, let's keep the conversation going. This is actually my last week at Transwestern, so if you'd like to contact me, you can find me here at Here Anywhere, which is going to be my new endeavor. So thank you very much, and thanks for listening.